So please let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jessica Cait. She got her PhD in integrative biology at University Guelph. Now she is a postdoctoral research fellow at Canadian Council on Animal Care. She will give us a topic from scientific evidence to guideline recommendation. How can animal welfare science learn from human medicine? Please welcome Dr. Jessica Cait.
Hi, thank you. Can I just ask to see if everyone can see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Then I will kick off because I have a lot to say in a short time. My name is Jessica. I work with Dr. Mark Avey at the Canadian Council on Animal Care and Georgia Mason at the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare at the University of Guelph. And I'm going to talk about how we can apply some of the practices that we use in human medicine to animal welfare, guideline, and policy development. A quick disclaimer, the views I express are my own and they do not represent the views of the Canadian Council on Animal Care. So I'll start off with something that we are all familiar with, which is that just because we have a lot of animal welfare evidence, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see a guideline change. And if we do see a guideline change, it can be a very slow process. So I work with laboratory mice, so I'm going to use a lot of mouse examples. But I'm just going to give an example of what this looked like with giving mice nesting materials. So in the 1960s, we saw the first evidence that nesting material might be important for laboratory mice. It wasn't until a few decades later that we had some really great evidence demonstrating that mice want nesting materials and that they would work to access nesting materials. So here we knew that definitely this mattered for their welfare. But it wasn't until 2 decades later that the EU actually mandated nesting materials for rodents. Then a bunch of other papers came out showing that nesting material didn't just matter for welfare, but it also mattered for thermoregulation. And this was all done by Brianna Gaskell and co. And then it wasn't until 9 years after the EU legislation that Canada actually started mandating nesting material be provided to laboratory mice. And here we are in present day, and there are several places around the world, including some of the most prolific animal users like the United States and China, that still do not give nesting materials to mice, or at least it's not required. And so even when policy change does happen, there's another problem, which is that policy and guidelines might represent conflicting scientific literature, and this can potentially result in harm. So another lab mouse example, and again, I'll pick on Canada. In Canada, we consider intraperitoneal injections of sedatives a better practice for euthanasia in rodents than cervical dislocation. And the guidelines argue that it's human error which is the issue, that cervical dislocation can result in severe suffering. But if you look at the literature, it seems like proper cervical dislocation is instantaneous, and IP injections are always known to be distressing and painful. So this is a case where we don't really know what is better. Since there's conflicting evidence, mice would really benefit from a systematic and formal assessment of all of the relevant literature. So even though expert committee made this recommendation, we don't really know if it was the right recommendation to make. And so the big issue here is that animal welfare guidelines tend to rely very heavily on expert opinion. And expert opinion is evidence informed, absolutely, but it's not evidence based. And so I'm just going to walk through what I mean by that. So expert opinion can just be wrong. Experts are subject to confirmation biases, so we tend to trust evidence that supports our own views. They're also subject to other biases. So they could be biased against certain labs or certain journals, and they can even be biased against literature published by female authors. This is something that Dr. Georgia Mason will talk about in her plenary, so I'll just leave it there. Expert opinion can also be influenced by committee composition. So some people can sway committees if they're more convincing or they're louder. And experts just can't be experts on everything. So sometimes they are forced to make decisions outside the scope of their real knowledge base. And so what can we learn from human medicine? Well, human medicine used to suffer from very similar issues to the one that we're experiencing with animal welfare guideline and policy development, because they used to use a very similar system, one that is evidence informed, but not evidence based. So I'm going to walk you through a human example using heart attacks. So in 1959, the very first study was conducted assessing the efficacy of thrombolytics, also called clot busters, in patients with heart attacks. So by 1973, there were 8 clinical trials that had been conducted looking at this efficacy. And if they had been pooled and looked at statistically together, meta-analyses would have demonstrated that this treatment did work. But thrombolytics only became the standard of care in the United States 15 years later, and then the EU and Canada followed shortly after. But this 15-year delay was quite an issue because it meant that over 1 million lives were lost because this wasn't implemented in standard practice, and these people wouldn't have died if they had had thrombolytics. And all said and done, there have been 33 trials conducted looking at the efficacy of thrombolytics on heart attacks. 25 of these were conducted unnecessarily. I estimate that that was about $250 million wasted dollars in clinical trials. So of course, this is redundant and wastes time and money. And so what medicine learned from these sorts of issues is that they can't afford to be incorrect and they can't afford to be this inefficient. And so one of the things they did was they moved away from evidence-informed practices and towards something that is evidence-based. And so an evidence-based solution is one that is systematic and rigorous, and it assesses all the available literature. So the human medical community came up with the evidence pyramid you might be familiar with, and they put expert opinion at the bottom of this pyramid just because of those biases that I was talking about earlier. And so what human medicine has done is move from expert opinion to higher quality evidence, which is systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And this is the evidence that they argue should be used in decision making. And on top of that, there's an additional process that takes systematic reviews and meta-analyses. It's called GRADE. There's other processes as well, but that's the one I'll focus on. And this is a framework for taking systematic review evidence and moving it into guideline and policy. And so some of the benefits of this process is that it requires you to critically appraise the research, so you're making truly evidence-based decisions. It increases transparency of the decision-making process, and it eliminates those biases that I was talking about earlier. And so GRADE stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluations. And it's a method for grading the quality of evidence and the strength of recommendations in guidelines. And so this was developed at McMaster in Canada in 2000. And what I want to highlight is that this is a very well adopted practice. So it really is a feasible practice. It's been adopted by over 120 organizations across 19 countries. And 2 key ones that I'll highlight here is that this is a practice used by the World Health Organization to inform human healthcare decisions, and it's also used by the European Commission. And so I want to walk through what an evidence-based process actually looks like. Well, it just starts at the very beginning, defining a research question. So you want to know what you're actually looking for, like what is the welfare impact of shelters for laboratory mice? And next, you choose animal-centered outcomes a priori. So you're not just looking at all evidence that exists on shelters for mice, for example, but you're looking at ones that truly matter for the animals. And so the important thing is using validated welfare indicators. And you use this to conduct a systematic review. Systematic reviews are governed by Cochrane, which is the governing body for systematic reviews of interventions. So I just put them here if you're interested in that. And so this whole process can be done by systematic review experts and welfare researchers. Of course, welfare researchers need to be involved in coming up with outcomes, but ideally the first 2 steps are really collaborative with guideline developers, and guideline developers would work with the researchers to come up with the research questions that are relevant to their guidelines, and they would also potentially commission the systematic reviews. Although the entire process can be done independently of guideline developers, and then guideline developers can use these systematic reviews later, but ideally it would be done in collaboration. So once the systematic review is conducted, you need to rate the quality of evidence, and this is using the GRADE process. So you take all of the findings that came in the systematic review and you actually assess how confident we can be in these findings and how good the quality of the evidence is. So you can downrate based on things like risk of bias or imprecision, and you can uprate based on other things like the magnitude of the effect or if you see a dose response. Then all of that is summarized into one conclusion, which is it's either like high quality evidence or very low quality or somewhere in between. And what this means is how confident you are that the evidence you see in this systematic review and meta-analysis truly demonstrates the effect of interest. And then all of this is summarized in a summary of findings table. So all of this is done by systematic review experts and welfare researchers if they're conducting systematic reviews. But then they're done and things move over to guideline developers. And so guideline developers take the results of the systematic review and the meta-analysis and they decide on the strength of the recommendation. So what they do here is they weigh the desirable consequences against the undesirable consequences, and they make a very categorical decision. They can say they are for or against the recommendation for the practice, and they can be weakly for it or strongly for it, weakly against or strongly against. And so again, this is done specifically by guideline developers. But the idea is here that this is a transparent process that minimizes distortions, biases, and conflicts of interest. And so it's transparent because it uses an a priori determined evidence to decision-making framework. And so, of course, this is a very complicated process, weighing positives and negatives. So a committee might make a strong recommendation. For example, if you know all animals are going to benefit from a specific practice, and they might make a weak recommendation if some strains or some specific animals would actually not benefit from implementing this practice everywhere. But in addition to this, the intervention might have negative consequences for others. So it might not just be about animals, it might be about human consequences. So this is something that guideline developers can put in their evidence to decision framework, and they can make these decisions transparently. So for example, killing with carbon monoxide might be good for welfare, but it could be dangerous to human health, and so it might not be recommended by the committee. And so that's the process. There are some other additional benefits of using this evidence-based process. One is that it encourages researchers to consider important outcomes prior to conducting their research. It means that we'll stop wasting resources investigating scientific questions that have already been answered. It allows us to identify literature gaps for future research, and that's a clear component of the process. It might also improve the rigor of animal welfare research because it is being scrutinized for its quality. And then it increases transparency in the evidence to the guideline development process. So this project is really in its infancy, but I am very excited about getting it off the ground. So if you are interested, or if you're also excited about it, please email me. I put my email up here. And then I also just put a couple other links here. So one is to the Cochrane training group. So if you're interested in how systematic reviews are done and how they're done rigorously, you can do that. And then there are a ton of grade options out there, so you can also check out the grade literature if you're interested in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So I saw the one question from the chat. When the systematic reviews and meta-analysis are perhaps not available, as with species that are not managed by people at a large scale, my feeling is that sometimes dog people and those with the boots on the ground can have a more welfare-centered opinion than academic expert. I was wondering what's your thought on this?
Okay, sorry, I was just trying to look for the question too. I feel like there was
from Carrie? Yeah, from Carrie.
There was a few different components to that question. So I guess was the first part, did I understand that correctly? What do you do if there aren't systematic reviews and meta-analyses available? That's the first part? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's not going to be a process where we can start tomorrow and say, okay, everything's evidence-based. We have systematic reviews for all practices. But what we need right now is a call to action for welfare researchers to start working on this and guideline developers to start endorsing grade practices so that people know that this is where we need to head And I know the systematic reviews and meta-analyses are becoming way more popular in animal health and in animal welfare. And so I think this is where we're going as a group. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight, but that's the plan. And sorry, was there a second component to that question? Whether it was animal...
The next one, how is the medical system funded? Is there a similar funding stream for animal welfare research?
Yeah, so I actually not super familiar with how medical streams are funded, but I think what is useful about this process is that it can be done by different groups. And if multiple groups have their own sources of funding, they can choose to do that, but also it can be collaborative. And so if one group is using grade processes and they have systematic reviews and meta-analyses that they are collaborating on, then those can also be applied to other areas, other countries, other guideline developers. So I think that this could be a potential global effort as well. So I don't know exactly about the funding per se, but depending on the country and the area, they can work accordingly.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Dr. Jessica. We appreciate your time and expertise on this important topic. So thank you.